My fiancé of 5 years said I wasn't wife material at dinner with his parents, so I showed them who really wasn't. We were at his parents' house for our monthly dinner when it happened. I'd been with Dylan for 5 years, living together for 3, and we'd been engaged for 8 months. His mom, Patricia, had been making passive-aggressive comments all evening about my career as a freelance graphic designer. Not stable enough, she kept saying. Not predictable income. The evening started with the usual ritual. I brought flowers and wine, greeted them with polite kisses and handshakes. Patricia served her famous roast beef while making pointed comments about how the neighbor's daughter just got promoted to senior manager at some Fortune 500 company. Real wife material, his dad Richard said, glancing meaningfully at Dylan. I tried to change the subject, mentioning the major rebranding project I'd just landed. A tech startup willing to pay more than most people's yearly salaries for 6 months of work. The kind of contract that would set me up financially for years. But Patricia just smiled that tight smile and said, "That's nice, dear. But what happens when you want children? Freelancing isn't exactly family-friendly. You can't just disappear for months at a time when you have real responsibilities." Richard leaned back in his chair, warming to the topic. Take my medical practice, for instance. Built it over 30 years. Patients who depend on me. Employees who count on steady paychecks. That's what provides security for a family, not these gig economy jobs that could disappear overnight. The heat rose in my cheeks, but I kept my voice level. The gig economy has been pretty good to me. I've consistently earned more than Dylan for the past 3 years. The words slipped out before I could stop them. Patricia's eyebrows shot up. Dylan's face flushed red. Richard cleared his throat and took a long sip of wine. "Well," Patricia said carefully, "money isn't everything. A marriage needs stability, traditional values, someone who understands their role in building a family." Dylan had been quiet through most of dinner, picking at his food while his parents dismantled my life choices piece by piece. I kept waiting for him to defend me, to remind them that my work had helped pay for his master's degree, that I'd supported him through 2 job changes and a career pivot when he decided accounting wasn't for him. Instead, he set down his fork and looked directly at his parents. "You know what? You're right. She's not really wife material." The words hit like a physical blow. 5 years together. 5 years of planning our future. Of me believing we were building something together. 5 years of shared dreams, lazy Sunday mornings, and nights when he'd told me I was everything he'd ever wanted. Patricia looked triumphant. Richard nodded approvingly. And Dylan just sat there, avoiding my eyes, his jaw set in that stubborn way I'd once found endearing. I probably should have walked out. Should have thrown my ring at him and stormed off dramatically. Instead, I smiled sweetly and said, "You're absolutely right. I'm not wife material. I'm much more than that." I excused myself to use the bathroom, but instead I went to Dylan's childhood bedroom where I knew he kept important documents. 5 years of living together meant I knew all his hiding spots. I also knew his laptop password, his social security number, and exactly where he kept the spare key to his apartment. More importantly, I knew about the credit cards he'd been hiding from me, the gambling debts he thought I didn't know about, the real reason he'd been pushing for us to get married so quickly after years of avoiding the topic. What I found in his laptop changed everything. Email chains between Dylan and his parents from the past 6 months. They weren't just encouraging him to dump me, they were actively planning it with military precision. Patricia writing about suitable replacements from the country club, Richard researching prenup laws to protect family assets, Dylan admitting he was only staying with me until he could access my savings to pay off his mounting gambling debts. They had actual spreadsheets calculating my net worth, detailed plans to get me to pay for the engagement party before dumping me, strategic discussions about timing the breakup for maximum financial benefit to Dylan. What I found in his bedroom was a complete betrayal that went deeper than I could have imagined in my worst nightmares. Bank statements showing cash advances totaling over $40,000, betting slips stuffed in old textbooks from college, screenshots of cryptocurrency trades that had gone catastrophically wrong, letters from debt collectors that he'd been intercepting before they reached our shared mailbox, some marked with increasingly threatening language about legal action. But the worst part was the email chain I found on his laptop, a digital paper trail of conspiracy that revealed the true nature of the people I'd been planning to call family. Messages between Dylan and his parents from the past 6 months that weren't just encouraging him to dump me. They were actively orchestrating it with the precision of a military operation. The first email was from Patricia, sent 3 days after Dylan had proposed to me. Subject line, "We need to discuss your future immediately. Urgent family meeting required. Dylan, your father and I are deeply concerned about this engagement. We understand you may have feelings for her, but you need to think practically about what marriage means for this family's future. She's not the kind of woman who can help elevate our social standing in this community. Her work is unstable, her background is modest, and frankly, she doesn't understand what it means to be part of something bigger than herself. We've spent decades building a reputation in this community, and marriage isn't just about personal feelings. It's about strategic alliances that benefit the entire family for generations." Richard had replied with typical bluntness, "Son, you're 30 years old. Time to think with your head, not your heart. The Harrison girl is still single. Excellent family, stable career at the bank, and her father mentioned a substantial trust fund that would be available upon marriage. That's the kind of alliance that builds generational wealth and secures our family's position in society. This current situation you're in is a dead end that will only drag us all down." But it was Dylan's response that shattered me completely, revealing a level of calculated betrayal that I hadn't thought him capable of. "I know you're both absolutely right, and I've been trying to figure out how to handle this situation for months. The problem is she's been supporting me financially while I got my career sorted out and dealt with some temporary setbacks. I can't afford to break up with her until I get my debt situation under control. She doesn't know about most of it, and I need time to either pay it off or find another solution that doesn't leave me financially vulnerable." My hands shook as I scrolled through months of correspondence, They had mapped out my entire disposal like a detailed business plan. Dylan would string me along until he found someone more suitable while simultaneously extracting as much financial benefit as possible. His parents had already contacted their family lawyer about a prenup that would protect their assets in case Dylan ever did marry someone they disapproved of. His dad had researched the laws about debt acquired before marriage versus during marriage, looking for legal loopholes they could exploit. They wanted him to marry someone with substantial family money, someone who could help dig him out of the financial hole he'd created while simultaneously boosting the family's social status in their country club circles. I was supposed to be the temporary girlfriend, the financial bridge who supported him until someone better came along. The only reason he'd proposed at all was because his gambling debts had gotten so bad that he needed a more permanent arrangement to access my savings and credit. There were even detailed discussions about how to systematically access my freelance income without raising suspicions. Patricia had suggested Dylan convince me to put both our names on my business accounts for supposed tax purposes. Richard wanted him to push for a joint investment portfolio that they could later claim was marital property if things went south. I found spreadsheets. Actual Excel spreadsheets that made my blood run cold. They'd calculated my net worth down to the dollar, estimated my earning potential based on my client history, and mapped out how much they could extract before cutting me loose. They'd researched my client list, estimated my project values, and even looked into my family's financial background to see if there were any additional assets they could eventually access through marriage. One email from Dylan made my stomach turn. She's so trusting, it's almost pathetic. She actually thinks we're planning a real future together. She has no idea I've already been using her credit to cover some of the smaller debts. The joint account we opened last month has been a goldmine. She never checks the statements because she trusts me completely. If I can keep this up for another 6 months, maybe I can get back to even before she catches on to what's happening. I screenshotted everything and sent it to myself, my hands trembling with a combination of rage and disbelief that threatened to overwhelm my ability to think clearly. Then I dug deeper into his laptop, following digital breadcrumbs that led to an even more horrifying picture of systematic deception. Hidden in a folder misleadingly labeled Tax Documents 2019, I found evidence of the gambling addiction I'd only suspected. Screenshots of online poker games where he'd lost thousands of dollars in single sessions. Sports betting apps with bet histories showing the terrifying progression from $100 wagers to amounts that made my stomach turn. Cryptocurrency trading platforms where he'd gambled away money faster than most people could earn it, chasing losses with increasingly desperate bets. But worse than the gambling was the systematic theft that had been happening right under my nose. Bank statements showing cash advances from credit cards I'd never seen or known existed. Loan applications using my personal information and forged signatures that looked disturbingly authentic. Screenshots of successful credit card applications where he'd listed me as a co-applicant without my knowledge or consent. He'd been stealing my identity piece by piece, opening accounts in my name, using my credit score and income information to secure loans that I'd be legally responsible for. Some of the paperwork was so sophisticated that it was clear he'd been planning this systematically for months, possibly years. The most recent email chain was from just last week, and it revealed the final phase of their elaborate plan. Patricia writing, "The sooner you end this relationship, the better for everyone involved. We've identified several suitable candidates through our country club connections and business networks. The Thompson girl just finished her MBA at Wharton, and her father owns Thompson Commercial Properties, half the downtown district. Much more appropriate for our family's future aspirations. Plus, she's young enough to give you several children quickly, which is important for family legacy." Dylan's reply was clinical in its callousness. "I'm working on the timeline and trying to optimize the extraction process. I want to time it perfectly so I can maximize what I get out of the situation before pulling the trigger. She's supposed to finish the big project she's working on next month. That should be a substantial payday that I can potentially access. Maybe I can get her to pay for the engagement party first, and possibly even some wedding deposits. The more I can extract before the breakup, the better position I'll be in financially to pursue someone more suitable." Richard had responded with what appeared to be a detailed breakup strategy. "Make sure you document any erratic behavior on her part leading up to and during the breakup. If she becomes emotional or unreasonable, record it discreetly. We want to establish a clear pattern of instability in case she tries to cause problems later or make accusations. Also, make sure any joint accounts are emptied before you tell her it's over. Once she knows, she'll likely try to protect her assets. They were planning to let me pay for my own humiliation, then steal whatever money they could access, and finally try to paint me as mentally unstable if I dared to object to any of it." I sat on his childhood bed, the same bed where he'd told me he loved me for the first time during a visit home 3 years ago, the same room where we'd planned our future and talked about having children someday, and felt something cold and calculating settle in my chest like ice water in my veins. The Dylan I'd loved, the future I'd imagined, the life I'd been building, none of it had ever been real. I'd been living in a carefully constructed illusion, playing a role in someone else's elaborate con game. But if they wanted to play games with people's lives and emotions, I was about to show them what a real strategist could accomplish when properly motivated. I went back downstairs to finish dinner, my phone now loaded with enough evidence to destroy all 3 of them completely and irrevocably. For the next hour, I delivered an Academy Award-worthy performance as the perfect dinner guest. I complimented Patricia's cooking with genuine enthusiasm, asking detailed questions about her techniques and requesting recipes I had no intention of ever making. I asked Richard about his golf game and listened attentively to his rambling story about nearly getting a hole-in-one last week, even making appropriate impressed noises at all the right moments. I made enthusiastic small talk about their upcoming vacation to Europe, even suggesting specific restaurants in Paris I'd heard were excellent, and asking Patricia about her plans for shopping in Milan. I was the picture of gracious femininity, exactly the kind of woman they claim to want for their son, except I was about to systematically destroy their lives with the information I'd just gathered. Dylan kept shooting me increasingly confused and nervous looks throughout dessert. He'd clearly expected me to storm out or cause a dramatic scene after his declaration that I wasn't wife material. His parents seemed pleased that I was taking their criticism so gracefully, probably interpreting my calm demeanor as acceptance of their judgment and submission to their family hierarchy. Patricia even squeezed my hand at one point and said with smug satisfaction, "See? We're all on the same side here. We just want what's best for everyone involved." When dessert was served, Patricia's signature tiramisu that she'd spent the entire meal telling me took 3 days to make properly and was a closely guarded family recipe. I raised my water glass with a smile that probably looked genuinely warm to anyone who didn't know what I'd just discovered. "Time for a toast," I announced brightly, "to family honesty and transparency." Patricia and Richard raised their glasses enthusiastically, clearly thinking I was being gracious about their earlier criticism and accepting my place in their carefully maintained family hierarchy. Dylan hesitantly lifted his wine glass, still watching me with that wary expression that suggested some primitive part of his brain recognized danger, even if he couldn't identify the source. "Dylan," I continued, turning to face him directly with the same warm smile I'd been wearing all evening, "I want to thank you for being so honest tonight about what kind of wife material I am. It really opened my eyes to how this family operates and what you all truly value in relationships." He shifted uncomfortably, but nodded, probably thinking he'd finally gotten through to me and that I was preparing to gracefully accept his judgment and step aside for someone more suitable. "So in the spirit of honesty and family transparency that you've all demonstrated so beautifully tonight, I think your parents should know some things about their son that might affect their opinion of who's really suitable for marriage in this family." I pulled out my phone with the same casual gesture I might use to show family photos and began reading from the screenshots with the same conversational tone I'd used to discuss their European vacation plans. Like how Dylan currently owes $43,127 in gambling debts to various online casinos, 3 different loan sharks who've been calling our apartment at all hours, and 2 cryptocurrency platforms that he's been systematically lying to me about for over a year. Patricia's wine glass stopped halfway to her lips, and I watched the color drain from her face in real time like someone had opened a valve. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Or how he's been systematically forging my signature on credit applications to open joint accounts without my knowledge or consent. I showed them the photos I'd taken of the documents, holding my phone so they could clearly see the evidence. 7 different credit cards, all maxed out on cash advances, 2 personal loans totaling $18,000, and a home equity line of credit application using my information and falsely claiming we're already married. Dylan's face went completely white, then flushed red, then white again in rapid succession. His hands were shaking visibly as he set down his wine glass. His dad started to say something, but I held up my hand in the same polite gesture I'd used earlier when asking for the tiramisu recipe. Oh, but wait. There's so much more to share in the spirit of family honesty and transparency. I scrolled to the email thread with the casual air of someone showing vacation photos. This lovely family correspondence, where you all discussed how to get rid of me once Dylan found someone with better financial prospects and more suitable social standing. I began reading aloud in the same pleasant tone I'd used to compliment the dinner. "Dylan, your father and I think the Harrison girl would be perfect. Good breeding, substantial family money, and young enough to give you several children quickly. Much more suitable than your current situation, which is frankly dragging down our family's reputation." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking from 3 rooms away. The sound seemed to echo off the formal dining room walls like a countdown to an explosion that would level everything in its path. Richard cleared his throat and tried to summon his usual authoritative tone. "Now see here, you can't just come into our home and—" "Let me finish reading Dylan's response first," I interrupted smoothly, my smile never wavering. "Here's what your precious son wrote back. I know you're absolutely right about everything. I've been trying to figure out how to handle this situation for months. The problem is she's been supporting me financially while I deal with some temporary setbacks. I can't afford to break up with her until I get my debt situation under control." Patricia's hand flew to her throat, and I noticed she was having trouble breathing properly. Dylan's mouth was opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, but no words were coming out. But my personal favorite is this absolute gem from just last week. I scrolled to the most recent emails, my voice still cheerful and conversational. Patricia writing about timing my breakup to happen after I pay for our engagement party, and Dylan's response about maybe getting me to pay for the wedding deposits first, then emptying our joint accounts before telling me it's over. I looked around the table at their shocked faces with genuine curiosity, as if I was asking for their opinion on a mildly interesting news article. "So when you talk about wife material and suitability for marriage, I'm just curious, does systematic identity theft factor into your definition? What about conspiracy to commit fraud? Or using someone's emotions to manipulate them into paying for their own humiliation while you shop around for a replacement?" The crystal stemware sat forgotten on the table, some glasses still half raised in the abandoned toast. Richard's face had turned a concerning shade of purple, and his breathing was becoming increasingly labored. Patricia looked like she might actually be physically ill, one hand pressed to her stomach and the other clutching the edge of the table for support. Dylan finally found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "You went through my private things. You violated my privacy." I laughed, a genuine, delighted sound that seemed to echo off the formal dining room walls and probably carried to the neighbors' houses. The laughter felt cathartic, like a pressure valve releasing years of suppressed intuition and ignored red flags. "Like you violated mine when you opened credit cards in my name? Like you violated our relationship when you spent months lying to me while planning my replacement? Like you violated my trust when you and your parents spent half a year plotting my disposal like I was yesterday's garbage? I stood up slowly and deliberately placed my engagement ring on the table next to my untouched tiramisu. The same tiramisu Patricia had spent 3 days making for the family dinner where they'd planned to tell, me I wasn't good enough for their precious son. You want to know about wife material? I asked, looking around the table at their shell-shocked faces. Wife material means honesty. It means partnership. It means building something together instead of parasitically feeding off someone else's success while shopping around for a better deal. I turned to Patricia first, my voice still conversational but with an edge that cut through the formal dining room atmosphere like a blade. You raised a son who thinks love means finding someone to exploit, who believes marriage is a business transaction where the woman should bring money and social connections, while the man brings nothing but entitlement and hidden debt. Then to Richard, whose face was still that alarming shade of purple. You taught him that worth is measured in dollars and social status, that people are commodities to be evaluated and discarded based on their usefulness to your family's social climbing aspirations. Finally, I looked at Dylan, really looked at him, seeing clearly for the first time in years who he actually was beneath the mask he'd been wearing throughout our entire relationship. And you let me support your dreams, pay your bills, build your credit, and plan our future while you actively shopped around for an upgrade. You let me believe I was building a life with someone who loved me when really I was just a temporary convenience with good credit and a steady income. I picked up my purse and headed for the door, my heels clicking on their marble foyer floor with satisfying authority. You're right about one thing, though. I'm not wife material for this family. I paused at the door and turned back to deliver my final line. I'm the kind of woman who pays her own bills, tells the truth, and doesn't need to marry into money to feel secure. I'm the kind of woman who builds businesses instead of gambling them away. I'm the kind of woman who honors commitments and treats people with respect. Apparently that makes me completely unsuitable for the Patterson family values. Dylan jumped up from his chair so quickly he nearly knocked it over, his napkin falling to the floor as he stumbled after me to the foyer. His parents remained frozen at the dinner table like a tableau of shock and horror, Patricia clutching her pearls and Richard staring at the evidence still displayed on my phone screen. Wait, Dylan called out desperately as I reached for the door handle. Please, let me explain. This isn't what it looks like. You're taking everything out of context. I turned back to face him one final time, and in that moment I felt something fundamental shift inside me. A complete transformation in how I saw him, how I saw myself, how I understood the entire architecture of our relationship. Oh, Dylan, I said with genuine pity in my voice. This is exactly what it looks like. It's what fraud looks like, what conspiracy looks like, what 3 adults plotting to financially and emotionally abuse someone looks like. He tried to reach for my arm, his movements desperate and uncoordinated, but I stepped back smoothly. The gambling addiction, the lies, even the initial debt. I could have forgiven those if you'd been honest with me, if you'd asked for help instead of systematically stealing from me. Addiction makes people do terrible things, and I understand that. But planning my replacement, shopping around for a better option while letting me pay your bills, conspiring with your parents to systematically extract money from me before discarding me like garbage, that's not addiction, Dylan. That's just being a fundamentally terrible human being. I could hear Patricia crying in the dining room, harsh sobs that sounded like they were being torn from her chest. Richard was shouting something about family loyalty and misunderstandings, but his voice sounded strained and distant. Oh, and Dylan, I added, my hand on the doorknob, delivering the final blow with surgical precision. I'm keeping all these screenshots, and I've already sent copies to my lawyer. If you try to use any of my personal information to open more accounts, or if any of you come anywhere near my apartment or my workplace, I'll be filing charges for identity theft, fraud, and conspiracy. Your parents' lawyer friend might want to add that to his prenup research. I walked out into the cool night air, drove home through the quiet suburban streets lined with houses full of families who probably had their own secrets, and immediately started the comprehensive process of reclaiming my life and protecting myself from further damage. The first thing I did was change every password on every account I had, from banking to social media to email. Then I spent the next 6 hours on the phone with credit monitoring services, banks, and credit card companies, flagging my accounts for potential fraud and requesting comprehensive credit reports that revealed the true extent of the damage. Over the next week, as I systematically uncovered each new violation, the true scope of Dylan's theft became clear. I discovered 2 more credit cards he'd opened using my information, both maxed out on cash advances that had been used for more gambling, a personal loan for $12,000 that I was legally responsible for, taken out using forged documents, 3 store credit accounts I'd never applied for. The total damage was approaching $60,000, money that had been stolen from my financial future while I'd been planning a wedding that was never going to happen. But the theft was only the beginning of their campaign of retaliation. The debt collector started calling his parents' house within days, apparently because Dylan had been giving them that address when his own phone was disconnected for non-payment. Patricia called me 6 times the first day, her voice becoming increasingly hysterical with each message. The first message was almost polite. Hello, dear. This is Patricia. We're having some issues with debt collectors calling about Dylan's situation. Could you please call me back so we can discuss how to handle this appropriately? By the third message, desperation was creeping in. Please, we really need to talk. These people are calling every hour saying terrible things about legal action. We had no idea how serious this had gotten. By the 6th message, she was openly sobbing. Please, you have to help us understand what's happening. We don't know how much he actually owes or who to believe. These people are threatening to sue us. Please, just call me back. I saved every message but never responded, recognizing them as attempts to manipulate me into taking responsibility for Dylan's choices. Richard showed up at my apartment building 3 days later, looking haggard and desperate in a way that would have been satisfying if it weren't so pathetic. The doorman called up to ask if I wanted to see him, and I could hear Richard's voice in the background, pleading his case with increasing desperation. Tell Mr. Patterson that his son can provide him with all the financial information he needs. I instructed the doorman calmly. Also tell him that any further attempts to contact me will be considered harassment and reported to the authorities. 2 weeks after the dinner, I received a formal letter from their family attorney, a document so bizarre that I read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. It was half apology, half legal threat, written in the kind of flowery language that lawyers use when they're trying to sound reasonable while making completely unreasonable demands. The letter acknowledged that Dylan had made some mistakes, but suggested that I was partially responsible for enabling his behavior by not monitoring our shared finances more carefully. It implied that a reasonable person would have noticed the warning signs earlier and taken steps to protect themselves, essentially blaming me for being too trusting. More incredibly, the letter strongly suggested that I sign a non-disclosure agreement about Dylan's private matters in exchange for a modest financial settlement of $5,000. Apparently, they were worried about their reputation in their social circles and wanted to ensure that I wouldn't discuss the situation with mutual friends, business associates, or potential future partners. The letter also hinted that if I chose to pursue criminal charges, they would be forced to defend Dylan by questioning my mental stability and suggesting that I had been a willing participant in his financial decisions. I forwarded the letter to my own attorney with a note. Please prepare whatever paperwork we need to ensure these people never contact me again. Also, please research what constitutes criminal fraud in cases involving identity theft and forged signatures. And please find out if attempting to buy someone's silence about crimes constitutes obstruction of justice. My lawyer called back within hours, and I could hear barely contained glee in his voice. The evidence I'd gathered was comprehensive enough to pursue both civil and criminal charges if I chose to. More importantly, he informed me that the family's attempt to buy my silence with a settlement and NDA, combined with their threats to question my mental stability, could absolutely be construed as obstruction of justice and witness intimidation. We could destroy them completely, he said with professional enthusiasm. The identity theft alone is worth several felony charges. Add in the conspiracy, the attempts at witness intimidation, and the systematic fraud. And we're looking at serious prison time for all 3 of them. I decided to wait and see what they did next before making any irreversible decisions about criminal prosecution. What they did was declare total war on my reputation and my business. Within a month, I started losing clients at an alarming rate that couldn't be explained by normal market fluctuations. Contracts that had been nearly finalized suddenly fell through with vague explanations about budget constraints or changes in company direction. Referrals dried up completely. New prospects would seem genuinely interested during initial conversations, then disappear without explanation or response to follow-up communications. When I pressed existing clients for details about why projects were being canceled, I got evasive responses about concerns regarding my reliability and professionalism. One potential client mentioned hearing that I was involved in some kind of legal trouble that might affect my ability to complete projects. Another said they'd been told I had serious personal issues that made me unstable to work with. It took me 3 weeks of detective work, calling contacts and tracing rumors back to their sources to discover that the sabotage was originating from Richard's medical practice. He'd been systematically contacting my clients and potential clients, using his reputation as a respected physician to lend credibility to his character assassination campaign. He was telling them that I was mentally unstable and that working with me posed a significant liability risk. He claimed I'd stolen money from his family and was facing criminal charges for fraud and identity theft. He painted a picture of me as an unhinged woman who was capable of anything when crossed, someone who might steal from clients or become violent if business relationships went sour. The irony was stunning and infuriating. They were destroying my career while simultaneously begging me not to pursue the criminal charges that would destroy Dylan's future and their family's reputation. Richard had weaponized his professional standing and decades of community connections to wage economic warfare against me, apparently believing that if he could make me desperate enough financially, I'd be forced to sign their NDA and accept their settlement just to survive. That's when I decided to stop playing defense and go on the offensive with the full force of my fury and intelligence. I compiled everything into a comprehensive dossier that read like a criminal prosecutor's dream case. Dylan's systematic fraud and identity theft, documented with bank statements, forged applications, and recorded phone calls. The family's conspiracy to manipulate and dispose of me, evidenced by months of email correspondence that revealed their true intentions. Richard's defamation campaign against my business, which I documented with recorded phone calls and witness statements from clients. Patricia's harassment calls, which I'd saved, transcribed, and had verified by a forensic audio expert. I sent copies to the state medical board with a formal complaint about Richard's abuse of his professional position and violation of medical ethics. I forwarded everything to the Better Business Bureau, the local bar association, and several consumer protection agencies. I contacted journalists who specialized in exposing financial crimes and white-collar fraud, providing them with a story that had all the elements of a compelling investigation. I also created a detailed timeline of events and posted it to my professional social media accounts. I named no names but described the situation clearly enough that anyone in our shared social circles would understand exactly who I was talking about. I framed it as a cautionary tale about recognizing financial abuse in relationships and the importance of protecting yourself from identity theft. The response was immediate and overwhelming in ways I hadn't anticipated. Other women began reaching out privately, sharing similar stories about Dylan that painted a picture of serial financial abuse spanning back to his college year. His college girlfriend had helped him pay off student loans before he disappeared one day, leaving her with a note saying he needed space to figure out his future. His previous fiancé had co-signed a car loan that she was still paying off 3 years later, along with credit card debt he'd accumulated in her name. There had been others, girlfriends who'd helped him through supposed rough patches, women who'd supported him during career changes, relationships that had ended abruptly once their financial usefulness expired. I wasn't his first victim. I was just the first one who'd gathered enough evidence to expose the pattern and fight back effectively. More importantly, my clients began reaching out to apologize and clarify what had actually happened during Richard's calls. His campaign had backfired spectacularly. Instead of convincing them I was unstable, he'd convinced them that I must have uncovered something serious enough to warrant such desperate retaliation from a supposedly respectable family. Several clients mentioned that Richard's behavior during the phone calls had actually made them more curious about my work and more sympathetic to my situation. His obvious desperation and the personal nature of his attacks had struck them as inappropriate and suspicious. Some had even done their own research and discovered Richard's medical practice online reviews, which painted a picture of an arrogant physician with poor bedside manner and questionable ethics. My business not only recovered but grew stronger than ever. The attempted sabotage had generated so much curiosity about my work and so much sympathy for my situation that I ended up with more clients than I could handle. I had to start a waiting list and raise my rates significantly to manage the overwhelming demand. The medical board investigation moved quickly once they saw the comprehensive evidence I'd provided. Richard's use of his professional credentials to defame me was a clear violation of medical ethics that could result in serious consequences. Within 2 months, he was facing a formal hearing that could result in the suspension or revocation of his medical license. 3 months after that dinner, I ran into Dylan at a coffee shop downtown. The transformation was shocking. He looked like a completely different person from the confident man I'd once planned to marry. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he wasn't sleeping well. His clothes were cheaper and ill-fitting. His hair was noticeably thinner, and he'd lost weight in a way that made him look gaunt rather than healthy. He was sitting alone at a corner table, hunched over a laptop with the desperate intensity of someone trying to salvage a sinking ship. When he saw me, his face went through a rapid series of expressions: surprise, shame, hope, and finally resignation. He tried to smile and wave as if we were old friends who'd simply lost touch over the years, as if a massive fraud and family conspiracy had been some kind of misunderstanding that time had resolved. I ignored him completely, bought my coffee with the calm confidence of someone whose life was thriving, and headed for the door without acknowledging his existence. He caught up with me on the sidewalk, jogging a few steps to match my pace in a display of desperation that would have been pathetic if it weren't so completely deserved. "Please," he said, slightly out of breath and clearly struggling to find the right words. "Can we talk? Just for a minute? I've been wanting to apologize, to explain what really happened." I stopped walking and turned to face him, studying his face with the detached interest of someone examining an insect under a microscope. "Dylan, I know exactly what happened. I have emails, bank statements, recorded conversations, and legal documentation. There's nothing left to explain." He ran his hands through his hair. "Definitely thinner now," I noted with satisfaction. "I loved you," he said quietly, as if this revelation would somehow change the fundamental facts of what he'd done. "I know I screwed everything up, but I really did love you. I just got in over my head and didn't know how to ask for help." I studied his face, looking for any trace of the man I'd once planned to marry. All I saw was someone who still didn't understand the difference between making mistakes and making calculated choices to harm another person. "You didn't love me, Dylan. You loved what I could do for you. There's a difference between loving someone and loving their usefulness to your life." I started walking again, but he kept pace beside me like a persistent salesman who couldn't take no for an answer. "My parents are making me sell my condo," he said, as if this information might somehow move me to sympathy. "They had to refinance their house to pay off the debts. Dad's practice is struggling because of the medical board investigation. Mom hasn't left the house in weeks because people keep asking questions at the country club." I stopped again and looked at him directly, genuinely curious about his psychological process. "Are you actually telling me this because you think I'll feel sorry for you?" He had the grace to look embarrassed, but he pressed on with the desperation of someone who had nothing left to lose. "I just wanted you to know that everyone paid a price for what happened. It's not like I got away with anything. We're all suffering consequences." "Dylan," I said slowly, as if speaking to a child with a learning disability, "you committed multiple felonies. Your parents tried to destroy my career to cover up your crimes. Your father violated medical ethics by using his professional position to attack my reputation. The fact that there were consequences doesn't make you victims. It makes you criminals who got caught." He was quiet for a long moment, and I could almost see the wheels turning in his head as he tried to find an angle that might work, some approach that might crack my resolve. Then, almost inaudibly, "Is there any chance you could forgive me? Not to get back together, but just to forgive me? For closure?" I considered the question seriously because forgiveness wasn't about him. It was about me letting go of the anger that had been both motivating and consuming me for months. "I can forgive the gambling addiction," I said finally, my voice thoughtful. "I can forgive the fear that kept you from asking for help initially. I can even forgive some of the early lies, because addiction makes people do desperate things they wouldn't normally do." He looked hopeful for the first time in our conversation, his posture straightening slightly. "But I can't forgive the systematic conspiracy with your parents to use me and discard me like garbage. I can't forgive the months of premeditated identity theft and financial fraud. And I absolutely cannot forgive trying to destroy my career when I chose not to immediately prosecute you for your crimes." I stepped closer to him, close enough to see the desperation and fear in his eyes, close enough to make sure he understood every word I was about to say. "Those weren't addiction behaviors, Dylan. Those were the actions of someone who genuinely believes other people exist solely for his benefit. That's not something I can forgive because it's not something you're actually sorry for. You're sorry you got caught, sorry there were consequences, sorry your life imploded, but you're not sorry you did it, because you still think you were entitled to do it." I walked away and left him standing on the sidewalk, probably for the last time in both our lives. 6 months after that encounter, I heard through mutual friends that Patricia and Richard's marriage had imploded under the financial and social pressure. The medical board had suspended Richard's license for 6 months and placed him on probation for 2 years. His practice had lost most of its patients, partly due to the ethics scandal and partly because his behavior during the investigation had revealed an arrogance and instability that made people uncomfortable. Patricia had moved to her sister's house in Florida, unable to face the social ostracism at the country club where she'd spent decades building her reputation. The house they'd lived in for 20 years was in foreclosure, the victim of the loans they'd taken out to pay Dylan's debts and mounting legal fees. Richard was living alone in a studio apartment across town, his medical practice reduced to a few elderly patients who hadn't heard about the scandal or didn't care enough to switch doctors. The man who'd once lectured me about building something solid had watched his own life crumble under the weight of his family's choices. Dylan, meanwhile, had moved back in with his father in that cramped studio apartment, two bitter men sharing a space barely large enough for one, both blaming everyone but themselves for their circumstances. The golden boy who was supposed to marry well and elevate the family status was now 31 years old, living with his disgraced father and working part-time at a call center. I, meanwhile, had landed the biggest client of my career, a tech company that wanted me to handle their complete rebranding for a year-long contract, worth more than most executives made in 3 years. The project was challenging, creative, and exactly the kind of work I'd always dreamed of doing. I moved to a beautiful downtown loft with floor-to-ceiling windows and exposed brick walls, the kind of space I'd fantasized about during all those years of supporting Dylan's dreams while putting my own on hold. The apartment was everything I'd wanted: modern, spacious, filled with natural light, and most importantly, entirely mine. I started dating someone new, a relationship that was everything my engagement to Dylan hadn't been: honest communication instead of hidden agendas, mutual support instead of financial parasitism, celebration of each other's successes instead of resentment and competition, someone who saw my independence as attractive rather than threatening, who wanted to build something together rather than extract value from me. When I told him the story of that dinner at Dylan's parents' house, he was horrified not just by their behavior, but by the fact that Dylan had let them attack me without defending me. "That's not love," he said simply. "Love means protecting each other, not throwing each other to the wolves to save yourself." The contrast was stark and illuminating. Here was what a healthy relationship looked like. Someone who built me up instead of tearing me down, who saw my success as something to celebrate rather than something to exploit or resent. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd been the type to just walk away quietly that night. If I'd let them continue thinking I was the problem, the unsuitable girlfriend who wasn't good enough for their perfect son. If I'd accepted their judgment and slipped away gracefully, letting them preserve their illusions about who was truly marriage material. But I realized something important that evening at their dinner table. Something that changed how I thought about relationships and self-worth forever. Being wife material isn't about having the right job or the right background or fitting into someone else's narrow definition of suitable. It's not about being palatable to judgmental future in-laws or conforming to outdated gender roles that reduce women to their economic utility. It's about being honest, being trustworthy, being someone who adds value to a relationship instead of just taking from it, being someone who builds people up instead of tearing them down, being capable of love that doesn't have conditions or exit strategies. Dylan failed that test spectacularly, and so did his parents. They raised a man who thought love meant finding someone to exploit, who believed marriage was a business transaction where the woman should bring money and social connections, while the man brought nothing but entitlement and hidden debt. They created a family dynamic where manipulation was normal, where people were valued only for what they could provide, where relationships were strategic alliances rather than emotional bonds. I showed them exactly who wasn't wife material that night, and it wasn't me. The experience taught me that sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is showing you exactly who they are. Dylan and his parents revealed their true selves that evening, and in doing so, they freed me from a future that would have been built on lies, financial abuse, and conditional love. I wasn't wife material for them, and that turned out to be the best possible outcome, because I deserved so much better than what they were offering. And eventually, I found it. The woman who wasn't wife material according to the Patterson family is now living her best life, financially secure, professionally successful, and in a relationship built on mutual respect and genuine love. The family who thought they were too good for me is now scattered, broke, and facing the consequences of their own toxic values. Sometimes justice doesn't come from the legal system or public vindication. Sometimes it comes from simply refusing to accept someone else's definition of your worth and building the life you actually deserve.